Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Alaska Pipeline Service Company, Alaska's pipeline to the future, delivering oil today, sustaining operations for tomorrow, committed to safety, operating the 800-mile Trans-Alaska Pipeline since 1977.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with the very latest weather information. You can do so by listening to NOAA Weather Radio or by heading to our webpage at weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. We'll get you to the same place. Give us a call at the Weather Info line, 800-472-0391. Find each Weather Service office on Twitter. If you were watching the Twitter feeds today, you would have seen some of the gust reports there from Juneau. You would have seen that Fairbanks hit 40 degrees this afternoon. So it's a good way to keep up to date with what's going on in between the Alaska Weather Show on Facebook, of course. U.S. National Weather Service Alaska, a great place to get kind of the rest of the story, especially with a lot more images there. Today we showed you something about the Cook Inlet ice and how it's kind of waning away thanks to some of the heat here in South Central. And on YouTube, you can get this broadcast from our broadcast partner that you're watching from right now, alaskapublic.org. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will find a link to this broadcast later this evening. And, of course, the most recent Alaska weather broadcast, if you go there right now, and during the afternoon, NWS Anchorage's channel on YouTube. Simply search for NWS Anchorage, all one word, and you'll get the daily afternoon map briefing, the same thing that you'll hear on Alaska Public Radio. Here's a look at the Bering Sea and several waves of low pressure traveling across, but all running into very stable air across the Bering and the west coast. And because of that, each one of these waves is kind of falling apart as it travels from west to east. None of them are moving terribly fast. None of them are terribly vigorous at this point. You can see some of the low clouds across the west coast. You can see some more active weather heading into the Gulf and several waves of low pressure circulating as they move away from the eastern coast of Asia. Well, let's look out west. Things are relatively quiet there, but the most active area on the map for really all of Alaska will be out across the western Aleutians, thanks to this system here coming up from the south and west and likely bringing some more rain to places like Shemya and perhaps Adak and Atka in the coming days. Across the rest of Alaska, you can see a wave of low pressure circulating just to the south and west of Haida Gwaii. The rest of Alaska is bone dry. It looks like it's severe clear for places like Fairbanks and Eagle and Northway, all the way down to Anchorage. The southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula has a few high clouds passing through. Kodiak looked clear today. We have some wind gusts across the west coast and the YK Delta there. Also a windy day around Delta Junction and just east of the pass. Southeast, it's pretty breezy out across Juneau. Gusts again ranged upwards of 50, maybe 70 miles per hour at times. The high wind warnings were allowed to expire earlier. And here's our next wave of low pressure working in from the west. As you look out across the central and western Aleutians, the cloud cover is moving in for more of a southerly direction now. That will inspire a better chance for some rain, perhaps rain mixed with snow across the western Bering. But all in all, a pretty quiet weather pattern for really most of Alaska. Areas of low clouds and fog across parts of the coastal plain, but even the north slope seems to be relatively quiet for right now. The active weather, mainly wind across southeast and a little bit of a breeze across the YK Delta. Here's a look at what we're seeing today on the weather map. Low pressure is in charge across the YK Delta just to the north of a weak area of around 1,011 millibars, and there were a few areas of light snow across Romans off. High pressure just north of Dutch Harbor on Alaska, just over 1,000 millibars, so it's not terribly strong there. The stronger ridge is located north across the Beaufort Sea and into the northern parts of the Yukon. We've got a pretty tight gradient, though, as you approach that from the eastern Gulf up to the north, and that's what's creating the stronger Taku winds there across southeast Alaska today. So some strong winds there for sure. Another wave of low pressure south and west of Haida Gwaii. You can see the occlusion wrapping all the way into the Pacific Northwest, and several troughs of low pressure, just kind of interruptions in that high pressure ridge, are trying to make it through that overall ridge pattern. So disrupting the flow a little bit, perhaps helping to move the air around, and certainly creating some gusts around the eastern part of the Alaska Range, and again in places like Delta Junction as we saw today. Now, trying to interrupt that flow are these waves of low pressure coming out of the North Pacific. They're making it into the Bering, but the farther north and east they travel, they start to fall apart fairly quickly. So we're going to see this occlusion really not hold on much longer. In fact, it's already falling apart as of tonight. But along that boundary, you're going to find some scattered snow showers there. So if you're traveling through the Bering Sea, perhaps south and west of the Pribilofs tonight, you'll likely see some of that. Out across the central and western Aleutians, a south and west wind moving north and east, bringing some rain and snow around Attu and Shemya. Out around the northern parts of the Alaska Range, onshore flow coming in from the north probably produces an isolated snow shower or two. It really doesn't look like much around Port Heiden or perhaps north of Sandpoint into False Pass and Cold Bay. South and east may see a few more clouds as we head through tonight. The bulk of any precipitation is still well to your south. It looks like pretty dry weather for you and still breezy through tonight and tomorrow. Wind gusts around the Juneau area and the Douglas region, probably approaching 50, maybe 60 miles per hour, but probably not as strong as what you saw today. At least that was the latest forecast as of this afternoon. And breezy conditions are going to continue across the eastern Alaska Range as well. The pressure gradient should loosen up just a little bit as we get into Wednesday. Out to the west, spot snow shower or two along this trough as you see across the YK Delta. The best chance for any snow is going to be a little bit farther out into the Bering Sea. St. Lawrence Island may catch a better opportunity there. And then the strongest low on the map, strongest storm out there across the western chain, bringing a stronger south and westerly flow to the central and western parts of the Aleutians, but still doesn't look like terribly strong wind at all. Across southeast, pressure gradient still there across the northern sections of southeast, so expect breezy conditions to continue again through tomorrow. Again, not as bad as what we saw today, we think. Low pressure is sitting just north of Kodiak Island, has a number of troughs attached to it. The breeze is not too bad across the Parks Highway or across the North Slope, but it is tightening up just a little bit there across the Beaufort Sea. High pressure is regaining control a little bit by Thursday across the north and the west. You can see that it is not really slowing down the trough working across the Bering, though. We've got a frontal boundary crossing through the central chain, low pressure north of Shemya and east of the Kamchatka at 995 millibars. Warmer air working northward toward St. Lawrence Island. Probably going to squeeze out some more snow for you, maybe just grazing the YK coast and heading into Norton Sound. Low pressure still sitting across the northern Gulf, still pretty weak, and a trough is still sitting across southeast. Again, the pressure gradient has relaxed a little bit across southeast, so the winds should be easing and subsiding across most of southeast, especially the inner waterways as we head through Thursday. And our front across the southern Gulf really hasn't moved very much. It's still occluded and still sitting and spinning there as it moves closer and closer to the Pacific Northwest. Temperature-wise today, well, you can see the number that sticks out like a sore thumb. That would be Ketchikan, 51 degrees today. A beautiful day there. A 39-degree reading as you head up the road a little bit toward the Juneau area. Temperatures were approaching 40 degrees, but it sure was blustery. 45 in Sitka. Yakutat was looking at mid-40s this afternoon. 39 in Valdez, 48 in Seward, 38 in Homer, about the same there in Kenai. Anchorage saw temperatures in the mid-30s. Talkeetna, 39. Up the road toward Healy, 39 degrees, 40 in Fairbanks today. Again, that information was shared earlier in the day on the Twitter account, NWS Fairbanks. 28 in Eagle, 23 around Tok and Northway. Temps in Fort Yukon showing mid-20s today. 36 for Ambler, Bettles, not too shabby there. 23 around Anaktuvuk Pass. The Arctic coast, mainly in the single digits. Kaktovik was pushing 10 degrees by late afternoon. Kotzebue Sound readings in the teens and 20s. Kivalina around 29, Kotzebue 26, Shishmar up near 12. Nome was up to 24, St. Lawrence Island at 30. The YK Delta anywhere from the teens to mid-20s. Bethel was 24 degrees. McGrath 30. Grayling and areas around Antioch were in the upper 20s. The Bristol Bay region anywhere from 30 to about 38 degrees in King Salmon. 30s all the way down the Alaska Peninsula. Dutch Harbor on Alaska closing in on 40. Purple Alps, we're looking at temps above freezing today and closer to 40 degrees for Adak and Atka, with Shemya showing 36. Overnight low temperatures will cool off. One thing about this high pressure system is it's pretty dry, and when you have a large range when you have a lot of dry air in place, it's pretty easy, especially now that we have a little more sunshine reaching the ground in Alaska, to have a pretty good diurnal range. Diurnal means the day-night shift there. So at night, we simply radiate any heat that we've gained into that clear, dry sky, and that's a lot easier to do when that air is considerably drier than when it's wet, perhaps after a rainstorm. So tonight we'll see temps dropping down into the teens and maybe even mid-20s in some cases around Prince William Sound, closer to 30 around Kodiak, low to mid-30s for the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, 33 in St. Paul, so not terribly cool for you. Southeast, upper 20s to mid-30s there. Sitka, one of the warmer spots closer to the coast. Juneau, about 28. For Yukon, though, clear and dry and closer to the high, 10 below. Look at Anaktuvuk Pass, only 1. Barrow down to 7 below. Kotzebue probably looking at temps around 13, 19 in Nome. St. Lawrence Island 23. But then the other side of that coin is that during the day, a little bit of sunshine goes a long way in temperatures. Once you get out of that morning inversion where all the cold air is hanging right over the ground, well, temperatures can go right through the roof. And we saw that again in Fairbanks today. Chances are it's going to be another mild day for you. 35 predicted, upper 30s for South Central, 42 in Seward, 41 in Kodiak, 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, 40 degrees or so around Atka. Southeast looking at temperatures in the upper 30s and lower 40s as well. Chances are in some places down in southern Southeast there will be one spot that pushes up on that 50-degree mark. So enjoy that when you find it. Around Fairbanks again in the interior, probably upper 20s and lower 30s. North of the Brooks Range, you'll see single-digit territory there around Wainwright and southward, anywhere from 5 to about 15 degrees. Kotzebue Sound temperatures in the teens and 20s, and Nome once again closing in on 30. Now, flying weather should be great across the interior. No restrictions there, not expecting any in southeast. IFR conditions may be found across the western part of the chain into the south and western Bering. MVFR across some parts of the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain, but maybe up to the Bering Strait. All in all, though, should be pretty good across your passes. So, like we said last week, you can do this with me. VFR conditions for Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass at VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should be okay. No turbulence expected to kind of shake things up through that area. Rainy Pass, VFR. Windy Pass expected to be visual. Isabel Pass, also VFR. You can guess Tanita Pass, also VFR there. Portage Pass should be beautiful. A great day to get into the Sound. Chilkoot and White Pass, also expected to be VFR. Freezing levels show a slight warming across the central and eastern part of the Gulf. The surface freezing line right there along the coast, but elevated warming starting to sneak its way northward thanks to that system sitting here just south and west of Haida Gwaii. We've also got a pocket of warmer air aloft across the north slope. Those levels range from 2 to about 4,000 feet, maybe a little bit higher over Barrow. Surface freezing line closing in on the ice edge itself, but just north of St. Paul, and you can see some pockets of slightly warmer air across the eastern chain and across the west. Icing potential shows that below 7,000 feet, but above 1,000 feet is your best opportunity for any icing tomorrow across the western chain, and maybe a pocket out there in the middle of the Gulf and across the Haida Gwaii area and into the Pacific Northwest. But really the air is terribly dry across the region. Thanks to our friend, the letter H. This weathercast certainly brought to you in part by that letter today. And because of that blocking system that's holding back any weather from moving in from eastern Siberia, we have established a huge control area across Alaska and a large part of the Yukon and British Columbia that is just really dry. All the moisture is heading to our south, being split by the jet stream that's traveling into the Pacific Northwest and the rest of the lower 48 and bypassing Alaska at this point. At 9,000 feet, high pressure sitting off the north coast is bringing in that north and easterly flow, keeping the coldest weather away from Alaska and keeping the active weather away from Alaska, with the exception of the western chain. There's some faster moving winds there between 15 and 50 knots there, with low pressure sitting across the extreme western part. An onshore flow coming into Kodiak from the south and east, and northerlies crossing the Alaska Peninsula between 25 and 40 knots. And we still have an east and northeast wind coming across the southern sections of southeast. At 3,000 feet, the wind speeds are much slower here, anywhere from 5 to maybe 10 knots. You have a little bit of a ridge across the western Gulf, and high pressure has established itself across the eastern part of the chain, with wind speeds there only at 20 knots. The fastest, most active area, again on this chart, will be across the western part of the Aleutians, with wind speeds there above around 50. They speed up here at 3,000 feet to as high as 60 knots, and then relatively light winds moving through the interior around high pressure anywhere from 15 to 30 knots. So what about turbulence? Not much. Below 6,000 feet, probably just south of the Brooks Range, we may find a little bit of a fast-moving area that could produce some chop just offshore of Point Hope and Point Lay. Light to isolated moderate is possible. It would be a little more sure of some areas around southeast, especially central and northern southeast, up to Icy Cape and Cape Fairweather and Yakutat. Below 6,000 feet, there's still plenty of wind moving through that area, and especially in the inner channels with wind gusts tomorrow. You should expect low-level wind shear there. Probably looking at gusts on the order of 50 knots or more, again right next to the surface. Probably going to have some gusts coming through the gaps there across the Alaska Peninsula. Nothing terrible, but something to be aware of tomorrow. And across the central and western Aleutians, especially the west, along that frontal boundary and below 6,000 feet, expect some occasional moderate turbulence. The rest of Alaska looks great. Visibility is at just a 5-star rating tomorrow, a VFR for most places, and turbulence is pretty limited in most parts of the 49. So that's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Now it's only emergency personnel should go outside.
Several times in the early 1990s, residents of Anchorage, Alaska awakened to a remarkable weather forecast. Volcanic ash ending this morning, turning sunny this afternoon. The city and much of southern Alaska had been plunged into darkness, shrouded in a cloud of volcanic ash as Mount Spur erupted to the west.
Anybody that has to go outside, I recommend that you cover your face with a scarf or mask.
Ash was everywhere. It settled on sidewalks, rooftops, cars. Any movement set the ash back into the air. The volume of volcanic activity in Alaska was suddenly on display.
Over half of all earthquakes that occur in the United States occur in Alaska. Over half of all volcanoes in the United States are in Alaska. We get 1 to 2 volcanic eruptions a year on average.
The Earth's crust is composed of moving plates, which continually change the landscape of Alaska.
What's happening here is that you have to get into the plate tectonics. The Pacific plate is moving underneath the North American plate here, subducting.
Yes.
And as the plate comes along and then it goes down underneath the North American plate. So we have what we call a plate boundary, a plate margin. At a certain point, as it gets down there, the materials melt again and come up, and that's where you get volcanic arcs.
Though many of the volcanoes are in extremely remote locations, there's a huge concern about public safety, and for good reason.
Aviation and volcanic ash don't mix at all. The big hazard in Alaska from volcanoes comes from the ash. We do have probably 20,000 people or more a day are flying above these volcanoes. The millions of pounds of cargo, air cargo going back and forth. In 1989, Mount Redoubt erupted. Mount Redoubt is a volcano here in Cook Inlet. About 50 miles or so to the north over the Talkeetna Mountains, a 747 flew into the ash cloud. So it wasn't even flying into it right over the volcano, it was quite a ways away. Flew into it and all 4 engines flamed out. They fell for about 4 minutes approximately, I don't remember the exact, before they were able to restart the engines and then land safely in Anchorage.
That close call with disaster led to the creation of the Alaska Volcano Observatory in Anchorage, which now operates sensors on scores of active volcanoes.
What we're looking at here are the 24-hour records from various seismometers that we have out in the Aleutians.
Within an hour of the massive Sumatra earthquake which set up the deadly Asian tsunami, the mountains here in Alaska began to shake.
After the Landers earthquake occurred in '92, this is a Southern California earthquake. It was a magnitude 7 something. It lit up the entire U.S. West Coast with little micro earthquakes. And so it was a big revolution in the seismology community because this is the only natural case we have where we know exactly what triggers an earthquake. And that's why it's so important, is because it gives us something that we can test. We know that these ground motions from the Sumatra earthquake on December 26 triggered these smaller ones. And so it gives us something to get our teeth into about what actually nucleates earthquakes. So that's why it's so exciting.
The link was headline news in the Anchorage Daily News. Sumatra quake sent shivers through Alaska's Mount Wrangell volcano.
Tom, what we have in mind,
Yes.
depart Golcana.
Yes.
We'll be climbing from about 1,500 feet to 45.
We wanted to see the volcano for ourselves. Was it still active? There was only one way to find out. Wrangell St. Elias National Park manager Will Tipton, who's also a veteran pilot, was the perfect person to give us a first-hand view.
It's big. That's what defines Wrangell St. Elias. It's huge, and it has huge wild wilderness qualities about it.
As is so often the case in Alaska, the only way to get into the state's more remote areas is by air.
Yeah. Wow. 13.2 million acres. 60% of the ice in Alaska is found right here, Wrangell St. Elias National Park. We have 9 of the 16 highest peaks in North America right here. We have the second tallest peak, second to Denali, of course.
Weather dictates where you go here. No wonder there's so much ice. You constantly work around clouds in this part of the world. But the mountains which shook were ever present.
We have an active volcano, Mount Wrangell, that we flew close to today. Last erupted about 1900. It may erupt again and undoubtedly will.
But one Alaska eruption was like no other.
Novoruptor at Katmai area eruption in 1912 is the largest volcanic eruption in the last century anywhere in the world.
Its force was at least 10 times that of Mount St. Helens, and the scars it left are visible today. When we come back, we'll visit the site where almost a century later, people are still talking about the mammoth volcanic eruption.
All I heard her mention was that they prayed a lot.
And of course, all this information that we're sharing with you about tsunamis and the volcanic eruptions and Tom Skilling's piece that he shared with us is in tandem with the anniversary, of course, of the 1964 tsunami and earthquake here. On Thursday, we'll be practicing a statewide drill. The first thing you'll notice is perhaps a warning on your cell phone or perhaps a radio or TV station that you watch telling you that there is a tsunami drill going on. If you hear that, don't be scared. It's just practice for all the agencies involved, including the National Weather Service and many others. So that'll be about 10:15 on Thursday, March 27th. Later in the afternoon, around 1:36, not at the anniversary time of 5:36, but 1:36 in the afternoon, there's going to be the Alaska Shakeout. And that will be an actual emergency drill for an earthquake, and you may be asked to participate that if you're in your home, school, church, or business. If you don't know about that yet, ask around. It's always a good time to practice being prepared, as we never know exactly when that next disaster is coming our way. Here's a look at the marine forecast for Southeast. Luckily, a disaster averted today after a breezy day. The winds should be settling down tonight and again tomorrow. They'll still be gusty in the inner waterways, probably not as bad as today. Across the Lynn Canal, a northerly flow around 35 knots, 25 knots sustained coming through the Frederick Sound and Stevens Passage area, and easterlies around 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Offshore, you're looking at winds developing around 25 to 35 knots, stronger winds up across the north. Still looking at higher gusts in all the regions, though, and like we were saying yesterday, around Juneau, those gusts may reach 50 miles per hour, so still looking at some of those higher gusts across the Lynn Canal tomorrow. Thursday, looking at winds still coming out of the north and northeast into the central inner waterways, and more of a coastal wind from the east to west around 20 knots with 4 to 5-foot seas in the central and north. Around the Dixon entrance, that could be as high as 6 feet. Variable flow around Prince William Sound and the northern Gulf Coast as we go through Wednesday, but do watch for some higher gusts coming out of the Copper River Basin. Those are expected tomorrow. North and northwesterly flow coming across the Barren Islands around 15 knots, 4 to 7-foot seas on either side. Variable flow east from Kodiak and across the western Gulf, a 7-foot sea expected there. Those become a little bit stronger from the north as we head into Thursday. 15 to 20 knot winds coming out of the Barren Islands and down the eastern side of Kodiak Island. Still looking at light and variable flow inside and outside of Prince William Sound, and in the Cook Inlet, a north and northeasterly wind around 10 knots. In the ice-free waters, those seas in the north could be as high as 2 feet. Across the Alaska Peninsula, a northwesterly wind around 15 knots coming in, and that might crank up a brief snow shower or so along the coast. Not a lot of moisture to work with, though, so don't look for much. Northerly flow in the North Pacific, 20-knot winds there with an 8-foot sea in the Pacific. As we head into Thursday, those winds strengthen just a little bit up to 25 knots up toward Castle Cape and Chignik with a 7-foot sea. Easterlies now on the north side of the peninsula. 4-foot seas are expected there, and very small seas, almost flat there inside Bristol Bay with a 10-knot wind from the north and east and a 1-foot sea predicted. A south and southwesterly flow coming in Nikolsky at 15 knots, 4 to 7-foot seas on either side of the chain. Across Adak and Atka, a southerly wind will blow, 30-knot winds there with a 6-foot sea. Stronger winds out across the west and west central areas. Around Kiska, a 12-foot sea should be expected on Wednesday. That becomes 13 feet on Thursday, with westerlies at 25 knots around Shemya and Attu. South and southwesterly flow for Tukolski, and Alaska will see more of a southerly flow with a 5-foot sea to the north, and stronger southerly winds across the central part of the chain at 35 knots with 9 to 13-foot seas on either side of Adak and Atka. Across the west, wind speeds are still pretty light south of St. Lawrence Island to Nunivak Island. Southwesterlies around the Pribilofs with a 5-foot sea. Northwesterlies out of Kuskokwim with a 2-foot sea there. Winds will blow from the 15-knot area around more of a westerly flow there on Thursday. Southeasterlies across Nunivak Island, and the winds are picking up out around the St. Matthew Island waters around 25 knots there. A southerly flow coming into the Bering Strait and over St. Lawrence Island around 20 knots for Thursday. On Wednesday, you can see southerlies making it across the Bering Strait and into the Chukchi between 10 and 20 knots. A stronger east and southeasterly flow across the Beaufort Seacoast around 20 to 25 knots. And then by Thursday, that continues, but we get a little bit of a shift in the wind north of Barrow. Southerlies are maintained from Point Lay all the way to the Kotzebue Sound area from about 15 to 20 knots. So a little bit of a change there on Thursday for especially areas east of Barrow. Let's recap your weather for tonight. Not a lot to talk about across the interior. Should be a beautiful night, but it will be cooling down quickly once you lose that glimmer of sun. Some spot snow showers across the YK Delta and some areas across the Alaska Peninsula. We've got several waves of low pressure across the North Pacific, some of those making their way into the western Bering Sea, but they're falling apart as they travel further and further north. Along those boundaries, you'll find some snow showers, and then eventually across the western chain, you'll run into a better chance for some light rain. Windy conditions still possible across a large part of southeastern Alaska tonight after a very mild day. The winds will be back again tomorrow, but probably not as strong as what you saw today around Juneau and the Douglas Island area. Low pressure across the north slope, trapping in some low clouds across the coastal plain. Nothing much to write home about, though. Still looks pretty dry and fairly mild for places like Fairbanks. Out to the south and west, the storm advances a little bit more into the western Bering Sea. You can see those waves of low pressure lining up, but also dying out as they approach St. Lawrence Island. Watch for a snow shower or two. Some of those around Norton Sound and probably in Nome on Wednesday. Winds still up on Thursday for southeast, but falling apart, and the beautiful weather in the interior continues. Have a good night.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.